Hello and welcome to Make Tartaria Great Again, the show where we blow an ancient civilization-sized hole into the realm's biggest deception. We are living amongst the ruins of a highly advanced civilization. There's endless evidence that contradicts the mainstream narrative, and we're not giving them a free pass anymore. I'm Chris Jolly.
I'm Matthew Scora, and we're your guides through this minefield of historical humbuggery, scientific and spiritual warfare, technological and suppression, and the thousand of other things that pass for Masonic theater and satanic inversion, and generally keeping us uninformed and unempowered and under control.
Now, in this podcast, we're going to peel back the layers of this fraudulent history and forget the timeline that we've been given because something's definitely off about it. I just kind of looked at things through a Tartarian lens. The show is about rethinking the quote unquote modern world. We're going to explore old world cities, different historical anomalies, and other pieces that just don't fit, like flat earth, missing time, free energy, all through this broader perspective that we're calling Tartarian.
We'll take you through cities like St. Augustine, Chicago, New Orleans, into undercover discrepancies that we're told and what we can observe with our own eyes. We'll dive into things like world fairs, orphan trains, and challenge everything we think we know.
For those of you who are un or under familiar with this topic, today's episode is going to give you the 400,000 foot view, explain exactly what we mean.
The term Tartarian gets thrown out a lot, and it's kind of interesting because Tartaria almost is kind of like a quick word to just basically say everything we think we know is wrong. We're not referring to a nomadic tribe in the plains of Asia or anything like that when we say Tartaria, but it's become a great buzzword to capture this energy and this free thinking, challenging of historical narratives that we've been taught. Commonly today, most people even refer to it as the old world.
Since this is our first episode, before we dive into that, I want to touch briefly kind of on how we got here in the first place and talk about what brought us down our respective rabbit holes. So, Matthew, how did you come to this topic?
So for me, my great awakening probably came from when I first learned about the health choices of the poison that I'd been consuming my whole life. I saw my mom, and my mom had a stroke, my dad had a heart attack, and I started taking in new information about health and food. And I learned what food is and what food isn't, and learned that 90% of the stuff that's being sold and given to us is not really food, but just poison. I went down this path of waking up through health. I discovered the most horrific scenes I've ever seen in my life, which were slaughterhouse footage. Yeah. When I became aware of that just opened a floodgate of new information that I just started to challenge everything. There was this blindness to them when it came to something as simple as food, that they were just kind of going along with the flow. And it was just a huge challenge or an awakening to see that I couldn't even necessarily trust my most loved people.
Yeah, it's funny how just examining one aspect of your life can really open up the way that you look at everything else. My story is definitely very similar. My health journey led me to veganism, led me to question the way that the world works and kind of the mainstream narrative that we're taught. I remember probably, like 2 decades ago when the Zeitgeist movie came out, if you remember that one, going down that rabbit hole. So it's all of these different little topics are some, thing that I've been diving into over the last 2 decades. And then you learn about the Tartarian thing, and it almost kind of puts a neat little bow and wraps everything together like this one conspiracy for all conspiracies, right? I always said that if I ever told people that I thought the earth was flat, I'd gone off the deep end. I believed in every conspiracy but that one. Then I investigated that one and now Tartaria.
I hope really that our viewers can reach the same conclusion that most people have in this community, that questioning history really does link everything that we think and know today. When we talk about food, flat earth, energy, nukes, all these other kind of conspiracies do come down to how we define ourselves. And so often we define ourselves by the history that has been given to us and shoved down our throats. On that note, when I met you, I met your significant other, and I met her because a friend was trying to challenge who was more crazy. And I started telling her these things that I just, were questioning. And she's like, yeah, Chris is this. And so I had to run over and meet you. And it was the last day of our conference. And I was still very scared to flat earth. In fact, I wouldn't have even identified as a flat earther, but I go over to you and I'm like, let's see if this guy is really questioning. And because I just wanted to test, because sometimes people say, oh, he's a conspiracy theorist because he believes in Bigfoot
Yeah, sure.
or aliens. And so I start talking to you and I start listing these things like, what do you think about viruses? What do you think about nukes? And then you're just like, oh yeah, no, no, no. You know, just like hitting the things that have been kind of settling that I didn't know for sure. But the way you said it with such confidence, I knew you had put time and research and energy into this. And then suddenly I remember on the drive home, I'm like, he's probably a flat earther. And I know all that information's right there, but I didn't have the courage to like convince myself to look deeper and finally really realize it's okay to be a flat earther, first of all. You know, it's okay to question that. There are a lot of people questioning things. There's a big community, it's a diverse community, and we all just need to get together and try to hash this out and discover truth and be sincere and be humble.
Yeah. People like to think that you act like you know it all, or, you're onto some different truth than them. To be honest with you, the more that I attempt to learn, the more that I think I know, the more that I realize I have no idea. And I can only go with what I see and observe. For example, the earth, it looks flat. I've been up in a plane, still looks flat from there. I've seen video from way up high, still looks flat. That is my observable reality. I don't observe it spinning. I don't observe it moving thousands of miles an hour through space, doing all these crazy corkscrews with every other planet and star system, all the exact, like, it's just kind of ridiculous. And so people have long called me a conspiracy theorist, but to be honest with you, I'm not trying to find conspiracies. I'm just examining what they have told us and what's before us and trying to look at it as though nobody had ever told me what I was supposed to think, come to it with new eyes and see what I see. And when you do that, you come to a lot of very different conclusions. And that's kind of how you get to Tartaria, I think.
Everything is so true for history too. If we just were to get rid of all the textbooks and all the little place cards that they give us and the narratives, and we just observe things through our own eyes, suddenly so much of history will just collapse. It'll collapse so fast. We'll really be left scrambling, not knowing what to do. And I think that's where most people get scared and then they just cling on to the official narrative because they're like, everything's broken. What do I do? Grab onto, and that's where I was, it's where my mind was. It was just clinging to some narrative because I was so scared of the unknown. But with Tartaria and questioning history, it's a whole new world and it ties everything together, and it's going to be a wonderful adventure that this podcast will take us. So you and I kept on tripping over odd facts, stuff that doesn't fit the story that we're taught or work in the timeline. Take, for instance, orphan trains. History says that over like 200,000 kids were shipped from cities to farms in the 1800s. But why so fast and why so many? And where did they come from? It's like they were repopulating ghost towns.
Yeah, it's crazy. When I first learned about orphan trains, it was just a few years ago. I was in school for over a decade. I took history every year. No one bothered to mention we just like dropped 250,000 parentless children out in the west of this country. Where did all these kids come from? How did this happen so close to when I was born and nobody ever told me about it? It's crazy. I remember one of the first toys I had was a Cabbage Patch doll. I had no way of knowing at the time, but that Cabbage Patch doll connects to the orphan trains ideas, the World's Fairs, and this idea that there was some kind of population reset. There's all these crazy postcards from the late 1800s and early 1900s of like kids growing in cabbage patches and as other types of produce, kids in baskets, kids with for sale signs, all of this crazy stuff that if we did today, you would never believe it. And it happened supposedly so close to our own lifetime, and mum's the word on it,
Or take the Empire State Building. It was built in under 400 days during the Great Depression, and that's something we're not taught. We just have accepted that this building was built somehow. We're fed this photo of the workers sitting on the crane, and no one ever really dives down to say, how was this actually built? Like, what technology was used? How was it built so fast? There's no way that we could complete a building like that in 410 days today.
Yeah, there are so many things that just don't fit the story we're told. Another crazy topic are those World's Fairs. The more you look into this stuff, the more unbelievable it becomes, right? The Chicago World's Fair in 1893 had some really incredible stats. This thing covered over 600 acres. They drained an entire swamp and put up over 200 buildings. Supposedly done in 2 years, all of these buildings, the entire city's worth of buildings, and then torn down. They actually say they were made to be torn down. And then if you look at the photos of these things, they are the most ornate, like amazing looking buildings you have ever seen. And then they try to say essentially they were made out of paper and plaster and stuff. It's insane.
The World's Fairs are a great topic for any new person to start when we're talking about the old world. And Chicago is a great place to start for what city to start in. Because why? Because the narrative is when you look at these pictures of what looks like an Atlantean Romanesque city that was temporary, you can ask the question today, like, why did they tear down those buildings? Well, they didn't tear down all the buildings. For example, today's Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry is still one of the original buildings, or sometimes I've heard people say that it was built right after it to mimic one of the ones. And today it's still around as a museum and it's interconnected with all these hidden tunnels. And there's no way that it could be built in a few short years for a World's Fair.
And then there's like the cathedrals, right? I mean, all over the world, honestly, but even here in the United States, you've got St. Patrick's in New York, which is built in the 1850s. It's got these massive domes. It's carved out of stone. And this was all done in a muddy town with wagons and no power tools and supposedly, not that many people. Or the Basilica in Denver, it's got these basement windows that are half buried, kind of just like the ground decided to rise up and eat part of it. There are similar buildings all over this realm whose story just doesn't fit with what we're told.
The pyramids in Egypt, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, if you go further back, it makes even less sense than what we're told is true. It's definitely clear that more advanced civilization preceded us. And we're being either lied to about the technology or there was a wonderful civilization that could do amazing magical things.
The further we look into it, the more we can see that they're really hiding something. Like, what's going on in space? Tell me that. We know we can't trust NASA, right? Have you seen the video of a stars through a Nikon P1000 camera? They look like these climatic patterns. The same thing you see when light goes through water or when sound is played through water. It's crazy. And then what is the shape of the Earth? Where does it end? What's on the other side? If the Earth is curved, why don't engineers ever account for it when they build railroads? Why do sailors and aviators navigate as though the world is a flat plane? Just so many things that don't make sense.
Now, how much of what we know is just not true? We know that history is fake, but how much? We know that there's many anomalies, but just how many? And if they don't fit the story we're given, could it mean that anything besides the narrative is wrong?
The mainstream narrative is clearly broken. That much we know. You can't explain if skyscraper going up in a year. They could do a similar feat today. 250,000 orphans just dropped off. Cathedrals made with no power tools by candlelight. Like, these people, I guess, worked all through the winter too. That never bothered them. And if the mainstream narrative falls apart and fails the test, we have to scrap it and start fresh. And, you alluded to that a little bit, Matthew, and how challenging it can be to let go of those things because in a sense, we come to identify with them, right? We believe that this is the person that we are. We believe that this is the earth that we are living on. And we see our whole world through the lens. And then when you start picking apart at that, it's like, well, if I'm going to let go of this, maybe this is wrong. And maybe that's wrong. And maybe this is wrong. And then you kind of have that feeling where you're just like free floating. But I think that we need to make sure that the story we create fits the evidence we have and not the other way around. And going by the evidence, there's clearly an advanced civilization who preceded us, and there's a massive cover-up about it. It's time to look into what kind of story fits the facts that we have.
Yeah, Tartaria is kind of interesting. So I was given this book, which is a Time Life magazine, very mainstream source of information. And it's called Feats and Wisdom of the Ancients. It's written just to make you feel comfortable enough to go, oh, okay, some cool stuff happened in the past. I'm going to stop really thinking about it. I'm going to not ask how the pyramids were built and let, academics argue over it and stuff like that. But oddly enough, this book actually mentions Tartaria. And so when you have a mainstream source like this mentioning Tartaria, it at least opens the gate to anyone that's going to quickly dismiss this as a conspiracy or as a false conspiracy and just throw it out the window when I would present this mainstream source of evidence that suggests that uses the word Tartaria. So if Tartaria wasn't a myth and it's real, then advanced civilizations definitely preceded us. And that's where we're going. This evidence supports a different assumption that we've long been told. Just like there's evidence of giants and anomalies that are left out by mainstream, no doubt hidden by the Smithsonian, Vatican, the Freemasons, all the three-letter alphabet groups of the world.
If we could only get into those vaults, I can only begin to imagine the information that is available there. But like you said, what's obvious is that people more advanced than us preceded us. We see the works that they left behind, which what we make today doesn't even rival them, like not even close. We can't explain these technological feats. We can't reproduce them today. These giant 20-ton stones that are cut with laser-like precision and then somehow moved into place. We have all these fantastical sounding explanations for what's supposed to be just ancient history, and just none of it makes sense. There was some kind of catastrophe, it seems like, something that they did to reset the realm, whether it was natural or man-made or a combination of the two. There's this kind of consistent campaign. It's not just something that happened once, although we do speculate, sometime in the 17 or 1800s, there was a mudflood or some sort of other worldwide event, but it seems to be something that happens on a repeated basis. And Matthew, if you look into like some of the Hopi and other Native American tradition and some of the legends of other indigenous people, you really find that they have this idea that there have been several different worlds of man that have preceded us and that we're in the fifth one right now. And the evidence of that reset is all around us.
The idea of a reboot is a fascinating idea. When I first heard the term mudflood, it kind of drove me. I got too biblical, too kind of like worried about like what it meant. And what I came across were some photos of Kansas City, and it shocked me to see cities literally covered in mud and them digging them out. And that was such a shock for me that it started to make sense about how multiple ages and stages and resets could have happened. Another form of evidence for this reset in population are the melted cities in Turkey. You can see these, that what they call them are like carvings. They look like apartment complexes that are like melted stone. So the idea that there were multiple resets is very true, because you can tell like that reset is different than the mudflood reset. Maybe it's always water. Maybe it's laser beams from blimps. I don't know what causes the reset, but it's definitely something that keeps you on your toes. Today, we're given this idea that the elite and rich are trying to always scare us about climate change and rising ocean levels. Off of the coast of California, there's this hidden structure called the Sycamore Ridge, and it's clearly a columned building right off of LA. And basically it goes to show you that like the coast of California used to be a lot different, and that there were rising ocean levels. I don't think there's going to be any more rising ocean levels. Many great cities, I think, were destroyed. And I'm not promoting the idea of climate change or anything like that, but I do believe that these resets, and I don't even want to call them natural disasters because I don't know what they are.
Yeah.
But they're definitely resets.
The flood myth is definitely very prevalent. Almost every culture has some story about a great deluge, but it could be volcanoes. They say asteroids, but I think there's a big problem with asteroids that we can probably talk about in another time. It definitely looks like you said, that buildings have been melted. And how do you melt stone? I don't really know. Some sort of direct energy weapon, some sort of technology that we clearly either don't have today or don't have publicly and don't use. There are the Great Fires. It's hard to understand the scale of the Great Fires and all of the different cities that burned down in a short period of time.
Yeah, the Great Fires is another key piece of evidence that we all really need to go look. I'm from Denver, and oddly enough, when you go through the city of Denver, you'll find amazing, huge castles, and you'll find all these structures that look as if you're out in Europe. And when I learned about the Denver fire and how most of the city was destroyed, hardly anyone ever died, and then you see these ruins that are akin to like World War II bombings, I asked the question, like, how come this isn't taught to us like day one of Colorado history? It's never taught. No one's ever talked about that. And in fact, the narrative and the drum beat that they're beating just introduces more questions, but we're not taught to ask those questions. We're taught to just accept it and shut up.
Yeah, when we started doing research for this podcast, I started looking into the history of Florida, which is where I'm living now. And I am in St. Augustine, which is our oldest continuously inhabited city in the US, at least from a European settlement. And then you dig into the history and like, The fact that Ponce de Leon landed here, well, we don't know. He didn't give exact coordinates, so he could have landed anywhere within, 200 miles of here. And then he was looking for the Fountain of Youth, right? We have a Fountain of Youth ecological park here. No, he wasn't. That's something somebody added on later to make him look like an idiot. Then the source material that we have for the early history of Florida is so thin. It's like, hey, here's a Jesuit scholar. Here's some priest. Here's the one explorer. That's all the information we have about 30 years of exploring Florida. It's so interesting and so few things add up. But I think it all comes back to that idea that there was something here before us. They've reset it at least once, maybe multiple times. And if we don't get hip to it and don't do something about it, they're going to do it again. They're already in the process of doing it.
Questioning the reboot and looking at our own cities is a great way to ask ourselves about like the technology and possibility that technology is being recycled and reused. Something that comes to my mind is an old postcard, supposedly from the 1800s, that's kind of hand drawn. And it's literally a Skype session. There's a person sitting in a chair and he's talking to someone that's being projected on the screen with one of those old fashioned phones. And the idea that technology could be reused, whether it's the internet, AI, or something like that, free energy, we just don't know.
For people who are having trouble questioning the mainstream narrative or are just starting to or want to dig deeper, here's some questions that I think you can be asking. First of all, would someone have a reason to lie and falsify history? I think it's pretty clear that there are many nefarious agendas out there that would definitely fall under that umbrella. Would people be able to lie and falsify history? I think there's also plenty of evidence that they have done it before. That one's a yes. There's definitely precedence for it. Is there evidence that an ancient civilization preceded us? I think we've touched on that pretty well. It seems like it. So, what doesn't fit the timeline that we're given? What has been or rumored to have been hidden from us? And what do we know or think that we know that just is not so? Matthew, when we were talking about what this podcast is going to be like and what exactly we would mean when we say Tartaria, you sent me some notes about what the concept meant to you, and I was pretty much right on board with that. Can you share with everybody about that?
Okay, yeah. So the idea and the word Tartarian for right now is just an anchor point to connect people who are challenging history in a very methodical way, because there's multiple ways to challenge histories. And just like any kind of debate, they always let you within this spectrum. Like you can debate history within this spectrum. And sometimes that is something, how were the pyramids built? And they'll give you this, they'll tell you it's either wind or it's either a lot of slaves or like that. And then you could just sit there and argue. But when we talk about Tartaria, we're talking about something much bigger than that. And it's very easy to prove that we're being held to these bounds of debate. And so I encourage you to think outside those bounds and really challenge things. When we talk about what our civilization, you and I today, we have to think about somewhere between 1776 and 1900 as the start of who we are. I know that seems weird because a lot of people will claim that they have journals and they're related to George Washington and they're related to, the first settlers in America and stuff like this. But when we talk about this reset and our civilization, that's the date range we're starting. And that's a lot sooner than most people think. But when we start debating this realm, we don't get stuck in the trap of arguing whether the pyramids are 12,000 years old or 15,000 years old. And that's a kind of a trap where I think mainstream archaeologists like to keep people. It's just arguing over these like dates that don't really matter. I mean, it might be important, but it's not as important as like who built the Erie Canal. And I think that's a huge one today to look at the Erie Canal. There's no way without motors and coordination and all this stuff that you could dig so many miles in so few time. And this is in the 1820s in 6 years, over 600 miles. And it's funny because we're just taught, as soon as someone questions that, you're taught, they have a narrative, they have a script, and then they talk over you and talk with such authority that it kind of puts you in your place. But nothing of that story makes sense. There's no way. I mean, I want you, the listener, to stop right now and really think about that. 600 miles, 1820s, a few settlers across New York. How do you coordinate the lodging, the bathing, the food, the shovels? where you take the dirt, all this stuff to build a canal that connects the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean. It's impossible to think that like these farmers in tights built that.
Yeah, and everywhere you look around the US and all around the world, there are these architectural marvels. And then the mainstream story is just this nonsense of like some clothes dresser who like submitted a freaking sketch. And so they made the building and like, okay, so this guy who's not an architect made this amazing, like, I'm not an architect. I couldn't put together a shed, let alone draw a Roman revival style building. And who made it? The guy didn't make the building himself, even like crazy. None of it makes sense. And we'll dive into a lot of that, another episode. What Make Tartaria Great Again is about uncovering the truth that we're living amongst the ruins of at least one, maybe multiple advanced civilizations, whether you call it Tartaria or whatever you like. But for anybody who's kind of new to the idea, let's back up. Where is it from?
The Tartaria roots have roots in alternate history, most notably from a Russian, I believe he was a mathematician, Anatoly Fomenko, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He wrote a book called The New Chronology. He claimed that history before the 17th century was fabricated.
Yeah. So the way that he stumbled upon this is really interesting. So the guy studies eclipses and noticed that there's something off, right? There's this constant from the moon, and there's a mysterious drop in it that happens about 600 years from 700 to 1300. It just kind of goes away. And all the other astronomers say, it's just some kind of like unnamed gravitational force. But Fomenko doesn't think so. So he checks out the eclipses and is trying to match them to recorded dates and places. And he looks using these mathematical and statistical models.
So that makes complete sense that the dates are misaligned in all these books and stuff, because the calendar, as we know it, has been changed. Mainstream accepts that like days have been added or subtracted here to align a few things here and there. The calendar and days are so changed and manipulated that it's very clear that like when someone's aligning these astrological events, that the dates simply don't line up with the calendars that they've been given us.
Yeah, whether it's like the Catholic Church or certain emperors, important people who want their reign to align to like a millennia, a certain year, a date, some sort of numerological thing, or whether it's the church like fudging things so that people will believe their timeline. Whatever the case may be, we're going to dig into that a little bit, because once I started to research about Fomenko and I started to learn about the actual timeline that we use, and that's even crazier. It's called the Scaliger chronology, named after this guy, Scaliger. It's the foundation of the conventional chronology.
Right. In his two major works, Emendatio Temporum, written in 1583, and Thesaurus Temporum, written around 1606, are said to have broadened classical history beyond Greek and Roman records to include Persian, Babylon, Egyptian, and Jewish histories, which is kind of odd. In most Hollywood teachings and mainstream school, we're not really taught who Babylon is, or very rarely do we touch on Persians or anything like that. But their history is so rich and deep. Scaliger supposedly examined these chronologies and even correcting errors in ancient calendar systems. He also introduced the Julian period, a cycle starting around 4700 BC, helping to standardize dates across the cultures of the world.
It's super interesting because then this Petavius guy, his student, popularized the BC AD system that we still use today. And he's credited with calculating the Earth's age. I get this, 6,000 years old. Some Christians believe that, based on the genealogies in the Bible, right? This person begat that person, begot that person. And they align that with the birth of Christ. So that means the modern chronology we use today is based on the biblical idea that the Earth is 6 millennia old.
As one would expect, this led to all sorts of anomalies that posed challenges to the timeline, such as these scholars knew that they couldn't resolve, such as Egyptian dynasties, which are said to predate the biblical flood. Like much of modern science and history, when they find something that doesn't us to believe, they just simply ignore it or try to misdirect us.
So we get right back to I know this doesn't make sense on all of the evidence, but you should believe us anyway. It's what I've started to call the just trust me, bro version of history. Keep in mind, too, that the documents this guy used to complete his timeline were often incomplete themselves or relied on translations that were full of errors. On top of this, his hypotheses were often so absurd that his contemporaries basically laughed him out of the room. And yet from this soup of data, these mistranslations, all of these errors, he somehow was magically to divine all the history that we're supposed to believe today. Based on this and the historical context and what he could remember about what else he'd read, and sometimes he would just chalk things up to miscopying. If the date was wrong, oh, a scribe just copied it wrong 150 years ago. Don't worry about it.
It's
Yep.
not just you or me either. Another critic of his work was Isaac Newton. There are also lots of critiques of many of the ancient texts that he used were not. So it's really not out of line to question the historical narrative, considering how easy it is to forge things and how much money would be behind forging documents and promoting timelines and narratives.
And obviously, with what we see with going on with AI right now, if this technology has been around before, it's hard to trust almost anything that they show you or put out there. So anyway, this flamenco guy thinks there's something amiss with the timeline, right? He comes to the conclusions that something is wrong about what they've been telling us. And he thinks that most of recorded history before the year 1000 is fabricated and the timeline is off by like 10 centuries. Part of this rewriting of history that he says is to hide the past of a large civilization. You guessed it, Tartarian.
You know, it's funny how you mentioned the repeating of history. Like the film you mentioned that kind of brought some of us to enlightenment, where it talked 9/11, the Fed, and Jesus, and how it was a repeat story from ancient Egypt. Flamenco argued that Tartaria, which was a huge region found on many old maps, like you can find old globes written with Tartaria, Tartary, tartar sauce. There's a lot of little like hints to it in our culture, and you'll find them on places. It wasn't just this region, just a small region, Russia. It stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean and even touched parts of America. Flamenco said it was a real advanced civilization, a powerhouse of technology with high culture. And when we talk about high culture, we talk about language, music, maybe museums, stuff like that. It's a very important concept to keep in one's mind that these people weren't just primitive, naked in the jungle type people. And they probably had energy and advanced tools and stuff like that. The out of place, impossible architecture, for example, when we look at old world buildings, we can't quite put our finger on what they were used for and all this stuff. And a lot of time they get painted off as churches or religious institutions, but it's very possible that they could have been used for energy. And we get a lot of battery type technology, our batteries with the anode and the cathode or whatever in different towers and church towers like Notre Dame. That's just an example of like what these old buildings could be. When we look at star forts, those have to be involved with energy production or creation, storage somehow as well. But Flamenco believes that elites like the Vatican or early empires scrubbed and edited in history, and they sought a way to control the narrative. And if you can hide free energy, then you can sell energy to people and people become dependent on it.
Yeah, and there's a semi-well-known document disclassified by the CIA that the Russians purposely hid Tartarian history. Before we go into the evidence for Tartaria, and there is plenty, I want to take some time to say that Flamenco's conclusions are not without complication. Of course, widely discredited by academia, as one would expect, but he's a pretty smart cookie, right? The guy won the state prize of the Russian Federation for Mathematics in 96, and he went to become the head of differential geometry at Moscow State University.
This is still a position he still holds today, some 3 decades later. His work in question, the new Chronology, is even older, going back to 1981. As you probably noticed, differential geometry is not exactly a field of history. Rather, he'd fallen into the writings of Nikola Alexandrovich Morozov, the Russian physicist who used astronomical analysis to conclude that much of historical chronology was incorrect. Flamenco took the theory and came to the conclusion that recorded human history only goes to about 800 AD, and almost everything we know about it has been fabricated.
There's an interesting theory that if you look at a lot of old buildings, coins, stuff like that, they don't actually say like 1500, they say J500. Now, I don't read or speak Russian. I don't believe you do either, judging on the pronunciations we've had so far. But a lot of Flamenco's works are still untranslated into English, and what has been done so is often done poorly. But one of the main criticisms we have about his work is he focuses on what is called the Russian horde. And this is a term that he uses to describe a medieval Russian empire that he claimed was a dominant superpower that shaped much of the history we have in this realm. Now, he argues that the traditional historical timelines, as we said, are distorted, And many events attributed to ancient civilizations, things like Rome and Greece, should actually be attributed to this Russian horde. So he supports this with some different statistical analysis of historical texts, some astronomical data, as well as linguistic parallels, asserting that a lot of time and a lot of events were duplicated and fabricated to compress history into a much shorter time frame.
There's a ton to unpack for Menko, and what happened to the dynasty that overthrew Russia and the communists, the genocide of 100 million Russo-Slavs. He could be right that history was rewritten to hide Russian influence, or it could be overzealous at Russian exceptionalism, portraying his country as the center of human progress.
People are always rewriting history when they overtake other countries, over cultures. It's something that has consistently been going on since there has been history. So I think it's no surprise that every conqueror tries to paint themselves in the best light, and that there's probably a lot to that story about the Russians as they expanded their empire, kind of rewriting and taking over the history of other peoples. So there's the idea of Tartaria's hidden civilization in Flamenco's work, which we're referring to when we talk about the Tartarian conspiracy and the Tartarian lens. But there's this broader framework that is not exactly like in lockstep with his theories, but can have an awful lot in common with it at times. So do we necessarily agree with this or that eclipse record, or the disparate kings list, or that all of these dates need to be wholesale rewritten? Not necessarily. Do we believe that there are probably countless cases in historical record where dates have been fudged, or parts of history have been plagiarized, or grafted from one thing to another, or completely, totally erased? Personally, I think you'd be a fool not to think so.
Just go out to any city in America and you can see these buildings. I'd say without a doubt, it's so obvious. We'll just call it Tartaria, the old world or something like that. But keep in mind that what often gets lost is the Tartarian explanation, is that it seems pretty clear that it's not just one, but multiple advanced civilizations came before us.
As far as Tartaria goes, there's definitely evidence that it was a real place, and lots of it. Numerous maps. We're talking like in the hundreds showing Tartaria or Tartaria Magna, going back as far as the 1500s and up until the mid 1800s, and other similar names sprawled across Asia, as you said, all the way up to Alaska and parts of North America. So the story they're trying to tell us is that it was just some loosely ascribed term that they gave to these nomadic peoples that lived in Asia and that they didn't know much about.
Flamenco's New Chronology was a great book to plant the seed in people's consciousness and open the world for like the fact that history is completely trashed. We're realizing that this information is spreading and a lot of more people are questioning history and are okay with questioning history and starting to look at great things like cathedrals, world fairs, and even more importantly, they're looking at the Mudflood.
Yeah, the Mudflood. That's a crazy one. And if you're just learning about it, it may sound like sci-fi. There's this idea that sometime maybe in the 17 or 1800s, a cataclysm buried the Tartarian Empire, these cities, under layers of mud. You can see it in old photos. There are these buildings that have windows that are half underground, or entrances to the building that are half underground, or there are photos of them doing excavations of a street today. And then when they excavate, they find out that the building they've been looking at has like 4 stories that are buried under layers of dirt. The Mudflood became associated with the Tartarian theory, and this really gained momentum around like 2016. You had content creators who started citing these architectural anomalies, buildings with these windows below street level, sunken foundations, evidence that a deluge of mud buried entire cities. You can see cities like Kansas City being dug out of mud. You can see railroad tracks being dug out of mud. The more you open your eyes to it, the more you will see it. After reading an article recently about how Oslo has largely gotten rid of cars in their city, I went to Google Maps to look at the street view to see what I could see, and I actually ended up at the Royal Palace. And what do you know? It's this giant monster of a building, and these windows are half windows, the rest are underground, and it hints that there's probably a much larger structure that is there.
When my child and I, we regularly go and find Tartarian buildings all around Colorado. And I would say, a third of them to maybe a quarter of them are definitely, they follow that pattern. They have these awkward windows. And when you go down the stairs to get into it or whatever, and you're just in this floor and you're like, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that it would be built like this. So we see that all over the place. And you can go out there in your own city and probably find that too. I wanted to emphasize the point that you did make earlier, and I want the viewership to consider the idea and go look this up yourself. Don't trust us, just go look at the document in 1957 where the CIA declassified that the Russians were trying to hide this culture, this civilization, this word. I mean, this word escaped from our vocabulary. It's very rare in history books. So we have to go and ask ourselves why they would do this. And that will lead to all sorts of answers for you.
It brings us back to that idea of a reset, right? It's not just the buildings, it's history, it's the memory of what happened, it's technology, it's culture. There are so many buildings around this realm that just don't fit in. Starfort's another crazy one. We've actually got one right here in St. Augustine where I live. They're all over America. They're all over Europe, and honestly, all over Earth. There are thousands of them on pretty much every continent. Antarctica we don't know about. They won't let us there. But you see these crazy designs, this stunning architecture, and then we look at what we can create today, right? It's like when NASA told us they couldn't go back to the moon because they lost the technology, right? So all the rest of our technology has gone like this. NASA lost the ability to go back to the moon. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into starports during our episode on St. Augustine. And as I stated a little bit earlier, uncovering Florida's history has led me to understand just how flimsy our grasp on certain historical events are, and just how much of it rests on what I call the trust me bro version of history. The more you look into it, the more you've got to question what you've been told. We've been deceived every which way from Sunday in regards to what has been taught about where we live. And if they can hide an entire civilization, Matthew, or the shape of the earth, if they can bury the history, what other truths can they hide from us?
Yeah, I know. It might seem like a leap to connect things like flat Earth and Tartarian conspiracy. In both cases, it underlines the willingness to hide humanity the truth. And call it the Matrix or simulation world or whatever we want. It affects us all. It's clear that we're only allowed to know specific things. And it's possible that like our technological advances today are just them releasing it to us bit by bit or whatever. But we are being censored at a scale that we can't even imagine. I wanted to talk about that too, was because a lot of people, they say, well, if the Russians were trying to do this, certainly we would call them out. Like if the Russians were faking history, America or the West would come and say, shame on you, Russia, you shouldn't fake history. And a lot of people use the same thing to like say, the Russians would have said, America, you didn't go to the moon. We're here to tell you that you didn't. We're going to tell the world and be the good guys. But what people fail to realize and accept is that it's a one world government already. They're all in on it together. That's the best way to put it.
So that's where a project that I'm really excited about comes in, because one of the things that I have found so important in this community is the involvement of every individual who is willing to go out and look at what is around them and try to make sense of the historical narrative and what is told. Find the buildings in their location that don't fit, find the histories that don't make sense and all these anomalies, and to bring them all together as a community, because this is how we're going to learn and grow and get a better grasp of what's actually going on. So it's something that I like to call the Escape Project. It's this neat little acronym, and it stands for Ending Simulated Containment Around Plain Earth. You'll notice I said plain Earth and not planet Earth.
Nice.
But the idea is basically that we're in some kind of container. If you want to call it an alien ant farm, if you want to call it a terrarium, if you just want to say we're under the firmament, like whatever the case may be, we're in some kind of enclosure, right? We're going to get to that soon, but let's first talk about this last decade. So we've had books that have come out, and we have claims that Tartarians built the pyramids, the Taj Mahal. We've got posts on Twitter and other sites with millions of views. It's crazy.
And it's not slowing down at all. I ordered this book called Old World. It talks all about it. It's a great introduction for people. I'd highly recommend. But the best thing that you could do is actually go out to your city, wherever you live, go take pictures, go read the little narrative that they provide you and question it and see how it breaks. Get online, get into these communities, post and talk to people and share your experiences, because you'll find random buildings everywhere you go.
Yeah, and you'll also find that so much of history is made up to get tourists to come to your city, which I've discovered about us here in St. Augustine. But basically, that's why we're here, right? Because there's all this stuff that the mainstream cannot explain. We're going to see later in the season in episode 3, when we look at cathedrals, there are these massive, perfect buildings that have been around hundreds or thousands of years, right? And they were built by people with horse and buggies and no power tools and no electricity and no formal blueprints. It boggles the mind to think the things that they want us to believe. And were they just pretty buildings, or were they power stations or some sort of other technology as they seem to be? But it started with people digging into the history, people in the forums, looking at maps, looking at old encyclopedias, old books to find out what's actually there.
Yeah, and the online community, including X and YouTube, it's just exploding, and people are connecting. They're talking about it. That's how we connected.
Yeah, so we just walked through how Tartaria went from basically old maps to a movement, and people waking up to the fact that so much of history is wrong or rewritten. But let's get to the point. We didn't just buy into Tartaria because there was like some conspiracy posted on the internet. It was more that we kept finding these facts, these weird, impossible things that the narrative that we've been told just can't explain. There are these cracks in the story, and they just want us to believe all this crazy stuff.
Everywhere we looked, something didn't add up. I remember the Orphan trains, the skyscrapers, the world fairs were really what got me. One day, my wife and I were watching Meet Me in St. Louis. I remember just watching it, and they're picking up the phone and calling New York, but they're also riding horse and buggy, and they're living in this elaborate like house, but they're just kind of like middle class people.
That's why I leaned into the Tartaria idea in the first place. It seemed to unite so many disparate threads, like this sort of one conspiracy to bind them all, right? Once you start to examine it, for example, what were the pyramids used for? It gets you to wonder a little bit about our larger environment. There's tons of evidence that the pyramids and other megalithic structures are part of a realm-wide technology and sort of a machine spread across the face of the earth. But the bigger implications for me were that we're clearly living, and I know we've hammered on this a lot, but we're living amongst the ruins of an ancient civilization. If you just use common sense, that's undeniable if you look at what's around you. And there's something manufactured about the environment that we're living in. There's a lot that's off about what they tell us about what the earth is, our place in the universe, even like the shape of the thing that we live on and its age.
I agree. For me personally, and I think a lot of people out there, Tartaria has been the conspiracy that unites everything. That is kind of the biggest one that encapsulates everything. I think my first conspiracy, like the moon landing, was in retrospect is such a baby step compared to then say like flat Earth. Like we don't know what's going on in Antarctica with the ice wall, pyramids, civilizations down there. For example, a great thing to look at is Devil's Tower in Wyoming. The narrative behind that is just natural erosion or whatever to make this tree-like stump petrified. You know, we know about petrified wood. If you look at it in any common sense, we see, no, that's a giant tree. And we start asking, well, why do we have folklore about the big lumberjack and his blue ox? And why do all the natives of that land have talks about the tree of life and giant trees? Like, it really gets us to open our mind and question all these big things. And when we ask about like what could actually do this, when we started talking about Operation Paperclip, MK Ultra, Roswell, EGI is another conspiracy that we'll have to talk about. It's a very interesting conspiracy that people need to get into and look into because it really changes everything on the world stage. And when you look at the news today, and if you get emotional about it, and it helps ground you in your emotions in realizing the world is a stage. Let's just try to dig to the truth and don't get too hyper emotional. Don't get mad at the person who disagrees with you about the latest news duality that they're pumping down our throats.
If I'm correct, the person that said all the world's a stage is Shakespeare. Well, really, probably Francis Bacon, who probably wrote all Shakespeare's work. But either way, in Shakespeare, who played the women's parts?
And which, yes, and the EGI conspiracy is a very interesting one. I have a funny story. When I started to talk to this conspiracy to people at work, a young guy said, well, I guess I'm gay then. And it was a perfect response to him realizing that some of these famous actresses that he had really been attracted to were indeed born biological men.
Yeah. Is it all of them, Matthew?
I don't know. I've learned to appreciate real women so much more, and it's been a gift. Honestly, the EGI conspiracy and awakening has been a gift because for so long as a man, I have been told to take this ideal Hollywood woman and compare it to the real women that I meet on the street. And it's always inadequate because the ideal woman that they put in my head were actually men. And of course, they'll never be like the real biological, beautiful women because it's like, oh, no, I like real women.
Yeah, you know what they say, if she's got an apple, she's got a banana. We'll have to do an episode on the first ladies because that's a really interesting one. I don't know if you've ever spent much time looking at photos of the first ladies, but they're not very ladylike.
Not very ladylike.
So if you've ever watched anything, for example, about the Earth being like a timepiece or some kind of planetarium or a terrarium, it's absolutely fascinating. And it makes it hard to come to any other conclusion than like I was saying before, we're trapped in this enclosed system, right? I believe, as I said, that exits exist. There's got to be something on the other side. If they're trying to keep us in, there is an out, there's something out there. So that's the idea that really drew me to wanting to do this podcast. If we can work together, maybe we can find out what the exits are. Maybe the Truman Show really is more real than most people realize.
Everywhere you look, whether it's Hollywood, music, books, the news, when you start to actually try to plug everything in together, you realize that there's so many missing pieces that the narrative, the mainstream narrative just crumbles. I love the idea that there is an out and we can find it together. I think when we come together and share this information and connect the dots together, it's going to paint a beautiful picture that will truly unite us all.
I hope personally that I can at least fly over the ice wall. I don't want to go into Antarctica. It's too cold. But that's really where we're going to draw the line, right? And that's what this podcast is ultimately about, uncovering and exposing their narrative for the nonsense it is, the fake history, and seeking to understand what really happened in this realm with our real eyes and our common sense, the observation and the wisdom of our bodies, our mind, and our spirit. If the facts don't fit the story, and so many of them don't, it's a story that needs to go, right? If the mainstream narrative falls apart, it's up to us to start to piece together a new narrative and to make sense of what actually came before us. If it's wrong, it's wrong. If it sounds impossible, it probably is. We can't just wish things away like the Smithsonian does, disappearing giant skeletons and other pieces of history. We've got to take what we're given and try to make sense of it. That's the other thing that we're really pushing for here, is for you to go out there and examine the evidence in your own town and to find out what you can find. The truth, as they say, will set you free. So let's all work together to figure out what that truth is. Eventually, we're going to create an archive and catalog all the evidence that we find here on the podcast. And you, as the viewer, can submit your own evidence as well.
Yeah, jump on X and please do a hashtag escape project so we can track it and start archiving all this evidence together, and we can share it amongst each other and just really grow and expand faster than we could by ourselves.
We are at MTGA Podcast on X. So Make Tartaria Great Again at MTGA Podcast. You can find us on there for now. All right. Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll see you next time.